Welcome to Look Ahead Radio with Tom Arms and Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints around the world, as a matter of fact, here on the talk station, FM 107 AM 1240, every Wednesday afternoon, almost without fail. We have joining us Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio, and of course that is heard Friday afternoons here on the talk station and radio stations around the country. And he's joining us live this evening from London, England, and if you'd like to call in and speak with him, feel free to do so. 252 area code 247-7282. It's 247-7282-910, area code 353-4674. 353-4674, toll free 800-818-2255. Via email at viewpointsradio@hotmail.com, and of course via Facebook at Viewpoints on the Talk Station. And Tom, good afternoon or good evening to you, sir. And well, before we get started on some of the news, as always, I'm curious, what is the weather like in your fair town of London?
Very cold.
Ooh, global warming, I gather. No, I'm sorry, climate change. Is this unusually, unseasonably cold?
Well, yes, it's not usually this cold this time of year. It's been freezing all day for a couple of days. When they talk about global warming, it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole world's going to get warmer, so the scientists say. In fact, one of the things we in Britain are concerned about is they say that the Gulf current from the Gulf of Mexico might shift slightly as a result of Gulf warming. Or of climate change, and we won't be getting quite as much of that warm current coming up and keeping us warm.
Well, you'll have your opportunity with those warm friendships in Europe that you're developing as with Brexit. We'll get into that in a few moments. Wow. Well, with that said, I just wanted you to know that. We, of course, have been paying close attention to the weather here. We've been waiting for rain, and fortunately, we finally have some here on the East Coast, and we've had some major fires, as you are aware. Tom, I know this isn't really on our list of topics, but this is an important one, and one quite interestingly is a sort of connection for you having recently visited Cuba, as we say here in the States. But the death of Castro, couple of questions. First, what has been the interest in Europe? What are the headlines of that? Has there been a great deal of interest, and what's the opinion of Fidel Castro there in Europe and in the UK?
Oh, the opinion was that he was a communist dictator. However, having said that, as a communist dictator, he was guilty of human rights abuses.
Minor detail.
Having said that, he was admired as a man of principle. A lot of communist dictators eventually turned out to be very corrupt. Ceausescu in Romania, even Brezhnev in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union in its last days was an incredibly corrupt society, which the Russians have just picked up from the current Russian regime. But in the case of Castro, he always lived his beliefs and principles. He never tried to steal from the state, at least not that anyone knows of.
Well, yes.
He lived fairly modestly, and he believed in his world revolution, and he always fought for that. You don't have to agree with him to admire the man for his principles. I don't agree with him. I have to admire a man who has principles.
I have to question his principles, but I'm going to leave it at that because there are questions.
You question his principles while still admiring him.
No, I can't even admire him.
For having principles.
No,
not necessarily the same, not those principles, but for sticking to what he believed in.
No, I that's a stretch for me, Tom. I couldn't even come close to that. But all right, so my question is, was he perceived? This death, is it perceived as something of national consequence? There's been a lot of effort to make this a national issue that have international impact. I mean, was there a perception that he was of international weight, that people hung on every word?
For a few years, he retired a few years ago. His brother took over. He's just been writing articles, making the occasional public appearance. But he's left the reins of government ages ago.
Okay.
And I think basically most people in Europe think the running now has to be done by the United States, that the Cubans have made themselves available for a change. They want to improve relations, but it has to be Congress in particular, and now the Trump administration, who actually takes it forward.
But wait a second, it was the Obama administration that extended the hand of, well,
I know the Obama administration did, but it has had its hands tied to a certain extent by Congress, to a large extent.
Right.
There's various laws. So Obama administration, from my understanding, is the Obama administration would like to take it further, but can't, because of restrictions applied to by Congress.
Right. Well,
and that's what I mean. It requires Congress to do a bit of the running.
Do you have any knowledge, and you may not at this point, of any of politicians or the heads of states that might be attending any of the services, memorials that are going to be conducted for Castro? Albeit, I don't even know if they're going to. He is an atheist, so I don't even know what kind of services they would have for him. But, maybe a party. Do you have any knowledge?
No.
Well, frankly, neither do I. And I think it's really kind of worth noting. To what would you send your heads of state, to what kind of an event? I mean, normally assuming that it would be a religious service of some nature, but maybe it's, as I said, a party. Okay, the other question associated with Castro, and we won't keep you much longer on this topic because there are others very important issues to talk about. You yourself have visited Cuba, and, this was in the midst of, if you will, détente. What was your takeaway from that experience?
Well, it's a desperately poor country. It was supported for years by the Soviet Union, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed, so did the Cuban economy. Basically, overnight, the Cuban economy, the GDP, was slashed by 50%. And you walk around Havana now, and half of the city is in ruins, literally in ruins. We were told to walk in the middle of the street. Because that was the safest place, because the balconies were likely to collapse and fall on top of you. So, people were discouraged. People were a bit angry with the Castro regime when I was there, which was about a year ago. They wanted to have relations with the United States. They wanted to reopen trade, and they needed it in order to rebuild their country. And I think there's a real opportunity for the United States to get in there and do something. And they will be remembered as people who saved Cuba. It's in a terrible state.
No question about that. And, of course, there are those who argue that the U.S. put Cuba in that terrible state. But then again, what happened to the future? What happened with European participation in Cuba? Now, then we're going to go to a break. Was there much interest in Cuba, financially speaking?
No, I wouldn't say so, because if you get too involved in Cuba, then the Americans get cross with you.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that may be the case. We'll shift gears to a case. We'll shift gears to the current, the future administration, the Trump administration. You've got a note here about the vote count and the danger of Twitter politics. I'm looking forward to hearing this comment from Tom Arms of LookAhead Radio and, of course, LookAheadNews.com. You're listening to Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
They say the best things in life are free. So, hey, why are we paying so much for our basic information and entertainment needs? The average cable TV bill has more than doubled in the last 10 years. The price of movie tickets keeps going up. So, exactly what is free today anyway? Well, you're listening to it. Local radio. Support the advertisers that support this radio station. And keep listening. We won't send you a bill. There are still some things you just shouldn't have to pay for.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms, and he's joining us from London, England, where it's a bit cold there. Tom, you've got a note here. Trump, a vote count, and the dangers of Twitter politics. And, of course, we've seen now that even Jill Stein's supporters are being pilloried for her efforts to initiate a vote, a recount in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and that apparently it's not going to work out well. But let me hear your comments about this. And I'm curious what's happening there, again, how it's being viewed in Europe.
Well, I think, nobody thinks that Jill Stein really has a case. For one thing, none of the computers that were being used in the counties which use computers to count votes were connected to the internet, so there's no way they could have been hacked into. At least that's what we've been told over here.
I think you're pretty right on that. Mm-hmm.
I think probably Jill Stein feels guilty about having basically taken votes away from Hillary Clinton and allowed Trump to win in doing so.
No, there's some thought that she took votes from Trump and he would have even won bigger. No, I'm being facetious. I'm not sure.
Well, I think she thinks she took them from Hillary.
Okay.
But at least that's what, it's how it's been reported over here. But what has really raised the eyebrows over here is Trump's claim that there were millions and millions of votes in California and the other states in which he lost that were rigged, that were stolen from him by corruption. And his tweet to that effect. And that's what I meant by Twitter politics.
Right.
And that has really raised eyebrows over here as another example of what they see as Mr. Trump's penchant for making outrageous statements,
right?
To sort of muddy the waters. If someone says or criticizes him in any way, he just goes full blast in with outrageous, totally unfounded accusations, for which there's no evidence at all.
No,
at least, as I said, that's how it's reported over here.
Well, no, I think it's
they're concerned that he's going to continue to do this when he's in the Oval Office, and in particular in relation to foreign policy.
Right, and the response that he may have related to criticisms from foreign leaders. That's a very interesting point. I've got a quick question for you, Tom, and we're going to move on to several items. We've got a lot to cover tonight. The concept of Twitter politics. How is social media used there in the United Kingdom, possibly, if you know, in Europe? Is it as influential? Is it used as often as it has been here in the States? And I might add, your relationship to Twitter, just as an aside, I was talking to a group of high schoolers about the campaign and just before the election. And it was interesting how many of the high schoolers paid note to Mr. Trump's tweets. So my question to you is, how influential is that form of communications there in the United Kingdom and in Europe, if you can go so far as Europe and around the world?
Oh, it's very important here in the UK. The UK is, I think, the most wired country in the world.
Okay, but do you use Twitter?
And people use Twitter. Okay, they use it for politics. They use it to make announcements.
Okay,
I think Trump has raised it to a new level. Okay. The idea of, I think here it's used more to make announcements.
Right.
Whereas Trump has used it for attacks.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and there's obviously a difference between the two.
Well, no question, but it is interesting that it's successful. And by the way, Keith, who's running the board, notes that Twitter posts are the equivalent of fake news headlines. They are a byte. That is a news byte. That's very interesting. Or a bit, actually, a bit. A good point, Ross. Thank you very much. Let's go to another item. Brexit. You've got a big court case and other legal challenges. And by the way, I have to make note of the success of the U.S. economy since the election, which I think is contrary to what a lot of people were expecting. But what's happening with Brexit, very quickly?
Well, on the U.S. economy, can I just point out, I'm not saying U.S. economy will probably do quite well, but the stock market is a very short-term barometer.
True.
And of course, what Trump has said is that he's going to spend a lot of money. $1 trillion plus on infrastructure and so forth. This is going to create jobs, and it's going to mean a lot of money is going to be spent on companies, and so companies' profits are going to go up. He's also said he's going to reduce advanced corporation tax, which also means that the profits will go up, and that the dividends that are paid to shareholders will go up, and therefore the stock market shares will go up. Or the stocks will go up as well.
So hopefully that'll put more people.
That is not necessarily a good thing for the economy in the long term.
Well, we've had announcements, of course, related to carrier. But let's move on to the other issue. I'm curious about Brexit and the big court case. What is the future of Brexit? Because I understand that, my goodness, it may not happen after all, due to.
No, we don't know that. It's very much up in the air. We had our first budget. It was a mini budget. Announcement in Parliament last week. And it was a pretty disastrous budget. Basically, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, same as the Secretary of the Treasury, said that because of Brexit, there was immediate £150 billion, which is almost $200 billion hole in British finances. And so they're going to have to borrow that much money. And they had planned to balance the budget in about 2 years. Now it looks like they won't be able to balance it for at least another decade.
Well, it's not been a problem.
This is because of the cost of Brexit.
It's not been a problem here in the States. We haven't had a balanced budget in many decades. All right. So there are other legal challenges. What's the deadline, by the way?
On the 5th of December, they're going to start a court case.
Okay.
And that is basically, it's an appeal from the High Court, which is the equivalent of the federal court, to the Supreme Court in the UK. And that will last for 3 days, and we won't hear the judgment until January.
Okay. So
now that would decide whether or not the government has to ask for Parliament to approve the results of the referendum. Now, if they do, if the court case goes against the government and they have to ask Parliament, it will basically, the danger is that it will delay a decision, possibly for several months. We don't know yet. We don't know what's going to be involved. We don't know what the court decision will be or anything like that. But if it delays it, then we're unlikely to have the negotiations for the exit from the EU completed before the general election is due.
And that is when?
That will be in 2020.
Wow. So Elaine may not be the prime minister at the time of the of Brexit.
Well, the point is she may not be, but the point is that you may have to have an election just as they're completing the negotiations. And if the election goes to a political party which doesn't like the terms, then they might have to start all over again or just call the whole thing off. Who knows?
Well, this is the conundrum that the EU is.
There's a by-election tomorrow,
and
in Richmond Park. Now this is very interesting. The by-election was called over the issue of the third runway at Heathrow, but the two main candidates, who are the Conservative Zach Goldsmith and the Lib Dem Sarah Olney, both agree on not wanting this third runway. So the issue has shifted away from that to basically a mini referendum on Brexit.
Wow. It's
now, the Conservatives had a 26, they had 58% of the vote.
Very quickly.
58% of the vote in 2015. The Lib Dems had, I think, 19% of the vote. But at the moment, the polls show the Lib Dems slightly ahead.
Okay, we'll get back to that in a moment. Our host for the program this afternoon, co-host, if you will, Tom Arms of LookAhead Radio, LookAheadNews.com. Tom, I've got to ask you about an interesting story since we're on the economy when we come back. the high-value banknotes in India, and what impact this is having on the Indian economy. And I'm curious, what impact will the European issue of the EU have on the Indian economy as well? Stay with us here on Viewpoints.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
Quick, what do these sounds have in common? These are the sounds of geography. Geography helps us understand connections between people and places. But our kids aren't getting enough of it. Half can't locate Japan or India, and 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. So we created MyWonderfulWorld.org to give kids the power of global knowledge. Go to MyWonderfulWorld.org to learn more. It's a wonderful world.
We now return to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints around the world with Tom Arms from London, England, joining us this afternoon. Of course, heard every Friday afternoon here on the talk station on Friday afternoon at WTKF-FM and AM 1240, and of course radio stations around the world as well, and his columns and his news site. His website is lookaheadnews.com. Tom, we've got to look at two quick stories. One, high value of banknotes in India. What's going on in India that this is suddenly the economy is just booming there?
No, not at all. It's basically Narendra Modi trying to deliver on his political promises made during the election, and also to put the economy on a bit sounder footing. He has withdrawn from circulation, or will be on the 30th of December. He's announced that everyone has to hand in their 500 and 1,000 rupee notes. Whoa. Now, just to give you an idea, these are the big denomination notes in India. 500 rupees is equivalent to $7.29. So wow. That's their big denomination note. Wow. Anyway, I was talking to Professor Thankamarun of Essex University, and he said that the purpose is both political and economic. A key campaign pledge of Modi was to end the black economy.
Okay.
His main target was the wealthy of India, who reputed to have more money stashed away in offshore tax havens than almost any other country in the world. Okay, so he set up a special investigations unit to handle the problem. And of course, the unit has had limited success, if even that, because it's coming against the big secrecy walls of Switzerland and the Cayman Islands and everywhere else. He has 36 months to make good on his election pledge before the next election. So he's going after the bottom end of the black economy instead, because that's his pledge. I'm going to sort out the black economy. All right? And the bottom end, of course, is all these millions of small business people who deal in cash and change the cash into large denomination banknotes and stuff them in the cookie jar or the mattress to avoid taxes. And so they're not happy.
No.
They've been demonstrating and waving their placards, but there's nothing they can do about it. And they're all queuing up now at the banks to deposit the money that was in their mattresses or in their cookie jars.
All right. Underground economy. Well, we've talked about that here in the States as well.
Can I just add, I mean, I know it's everywhere, but the result is there's so much money involved that the banks are now awash with cash.
Oh.
And so that's the good side.
They have more to lend, I would assume.
Exactly. And it's creating more of a more stable banking industry in India.
Okay. I want to move on to a few other items. We've watched with interest what's happening politically in Europe, particularly Germany and France. And by the way, it's looking more and more like there's going to be a very conservative French government. But now we've got a situation in Italy, and this has, since we're on finances, has a big impact on the financial situation in Europe as well, the European economy. But you've got an Italian referendum. Tell us about this.
Well, it's going to be a referendum on Sunday, and it could lead to Italy pulling out of the euro. although that's not what the referendum is about.
But it may result in that.
It may result in that. Now, Italy is one of those countries where it's just such a mess politically, and people always arguing. And the way the system is structured, and has been structured for decades, it allows the politicians just to delay legislation for years and years and years, and nothing ever seems to get done. So the Prime Minister, Matteo Renzi, came up with a plan to avoid that or get around it. And what he was going to do was basically, he was going to take away all the power of the Senate and make it indirectly elected. And all the power would be in the Chamber of Deputies, which is the lower house. And he would change the electoral law so it was easier for one political party to have a plurality or majority in the lower house and thus be able to push legislation through. Okay, that was the plan. Okay, and that's what the referendum is on, whether or not to accept those constitutional changes. But the problem is the voters didn't like it that way. They decided to make it a vote instead on whether or not Renzi was a good man or whether he was trying to gather too much power into his own hands, and whether or not they wanted to stay in the euro. And so they basically changed the parameters of the referendum. The campaigners ended up being about something completely different. And the last count, Renzi was 10 points behind the opposition.
So if he loses, what happens to the experience?
He says he's going to resign. And if he resigns, there's likely to be an election. And a political party called the Five Star Movement, who's led by a comedian, is likely to win that. And they are opposed to the euro and want to pull Italy out of the euro. They pull Italy out of the euro. It's another body blow for the European Union, following very quickly on the heels of Brexit.
Sounds to me like things are really heating up in the European market, and particularly when it comes to influence on the euro. All right, a few other items here. I wanted, since we're talking about political upheaval, before we go to the break, let's talk about South Korean President Park. She's offered to resign, but then has asked, why should she, if I understand correctly? What's happening in South Korea?
South Korea is a great story. It's the political life in South Korea it's beginning to read like a really bad paperback novel. It has all the right elements. It's a Rasputin-like figure. There's seances in the presidential palace. There's a dictator, and then there's his lonely, unmarried presidential daughter. To really understand it, you've got to go right back to the 60s, when the current president, Park's father, took power in a coup. All right? Now, while he was in office, his wife was murdered. And he became friends with this chap, what was his name? Choi. He became friends with this chap, Choi, who had a cult called the Eternal Church, or the Church of the Eternal Life. Mm-hmm. And Choi was able to reach into the president's life by holding seances in which he carried messages from his dead wife.
Right.
And the messages said that he should become the major figure in his daughter's life.
Wow.
Okay? The president's daughter's life. Park, in turn, is assassinated by the head of the South Korean CIA. And the reason he's assassinated is because of the influence of Choi on his life. Choi then goes on to mentor his daughter, who goes into politics.
And of course, she is now the president.
And she becomes the president. Choi dies, but his daughter, Choi Soo-lin, takes over from him.
Go ahead.
I think this is just too good. And she almost moves into the presidential palace helps the president to write her speeches and advises her and everything else, but she never gets security clearance.
Right. I'll tell you what, this just shows that politics is now more of a theater than it is real politics. I think it's, I think this is special. All right, we're going to come back. We're going to wrap things up. We've got to talk about the events in Turkey. That's a big story. And then a Belgian beer culture granted by UNESCO. I've got to hear about this in just a moment with Look Ahead Around the World, look at viewpoints around the world with Look Ahead Radio host Tom Arms.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
Observations of an Expat by Tom Arms from LookAheadNews.com. The philosophical foundations of the world are shifting. Fact, evidence, they're becoming irrelevant, even though they've governed our decision-making processes for nearly 350 years. And they have been a good 350 years for the Eurocentric Western world. Let's start with that scientific colossus, Sir Isaac Newton. He based his conclusions on what he could prove with his senses. He saw with his eyes that the apple fell from the tree, and he felt it on his head. He saw that when a croquet ball collided with another, there was a physical reaction. In the 17th century, Sir Isaac laid the scientific foundations which eventually led to man landing on the moon. He also laid the foundations for what became known as natural philosophy. That is the belief that the answer to human relations lies in the study of nature. Newton said that every action has a reaction. Well, in politics, every decision, every word, every campaign promise has a consequence. Or at least it did. Today's political dialogue is dominated not by facts, but by the ability of politicians to manipulate the electorate's fears and prejudices with distortions and lies. Nothing new? Well, yes and no. Politicians have always misled the public, but since the time of Newton, governments have had a free press to hold them to account. The economic decline of the traditional press has opened new vistas for unprincipled politicians. In the U.S., Donald Trump bypassed the media and transmitted his message of hate and prejudice direct to voters through social media. When challenged, he and his supporters simply drowned out the opposition with the bully boy tactics of shouting louder and longer. In eastern Ukraine, Russian troops have been seen and photographed. "It's a Western lie," shouts Vladimir Putin. A Russian missile was identified as responsible for shooting down a Malaysian airliner. "It's a Western lie," shouts Vladimir Putin. Russian planes have been seen bombing humanitarian convoys in Syria. "It's a Western lie," shouts Vladimir Putin. Maybe he's right. He shouts loud enough. Turkish President Erdogan is more traditional in his approach to the opposition. Since the attempted military coup, he has fired 110,000 civil servants, locked up 10 parliamentarians, and arrested thousands of academics and army officers. Erdogan commandeered the authority to appoint the heads of all universities, and his country is now the world's #1 jailer of journalists. Since July, 170 media outlets have been closed. An independent judiciary has for centuries sat alongside the free press as guardian of liberty and protector of the rights of the individual. In Britain, home of Sir Isaac and long regarded as the traditional protector of individual liberties, the Brexiteers have branded the second highest court in the land enemies of the people because of their refusal to allow the pro-Brexit government to start exiting the European Union without a parliamentary vote. The case has been appealed to Britain's Supreme Court. Judges who sit on the court's bench are refusing public speaking engagements because of threats against them by Brexiteer supporters. Sir Isaac Newton helped lay the foundations of anti-clerical humanism. Ironically, he was also a deeply religious man who spent more time studying and writing about the Bible than he did about math and science. It is believed that his failure to reconcile his strong faith with the evidence of nature led to insanity in later years. Humanism and natural philosophy were a reaction against a faith-based society controlled by a church who answered the omnipresent realities of death and misery with promises of a glorious afterlife. They had no proof. There was no evidence. But if you had faith, paid your tithe, bought indulgences, and endowed the church, you would enjoy a glorious heaven. Trump fails to offer proof that he can make America great again. The Brexiteers offer no evidence that life will be better out of Europe. They both hark back to the days before the age of reason to say, believe in me.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints around the world with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio and LookAheadNews.com. Tom, I want to get to a pretty important issue, and then we'll move on to a few other lighter items as we've got about 3 minutes to go here on the program. Turkey with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Things are really heating up. He has now threatened to release all the refugees into Hungary. This could have massive influence on the European economy and those countries in the pathway of these refugees. What in the world is going on in Turkey?
Well, there's 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. And last spring, he struck a deal with the EU, which said that Turkey's accession talks would be fast-tracked. Turkey would receive $3 billion in aid, and also Turks would be given visa-free access to the EU. And all this was supposed to, the visa-free access was supposed to start on the 1st of October. And the EU has delivered on only one of those promises, and that's the aid. And that's the reason Erdogan is now starting to threaten to let the refugees out of the camp. The reason why, and the European Parliament has actually said, we don't want to have accession talks anymore. They've said, no more. Now, it's not their decision, it's the decision of the Council of Ministers, which is the prime ministers, but still it's a signal that they don't want Turkey in the EU.
Wow.
And the reason is because Erdogan's a dictator.
Well,
the EU is a club of democratic states.
All right. Well, the problem they have is a ticking time bomb, and quite frankly,
and what it is, I think the two sides are indulging in a bit of brinkmanship. Europe is terrified of the economic, social, and political repercussions of being swamped with 3 million refugees. Mm-hmm. But Erdogan also knows that if he does let the refugees loose, he will have completely ended all hopes of EU membership. And a lot of the Turkish middle class really yearn for membership of the EU.
Well, and of course, then we have the question as to whether or not the EU will stay in its current form as a result of Brexit, Italy, and other countries that are, and France.
Everything is in a state of flux.
Everything is in a state of flux. All right. The other aspect of Turkey, I want to touch on this very quickly. We haven't been following a great deal of news on this of late related to the Middle East and the influence and the impact of Turkey on the war in Syria and the unrest. And of course, the question is, the Russians are flexing their muscles, and they at times were actually expressing an interest in becoming friendlier with Turkey. With about just about a minute before we go to another item, how much of an impact will this have on the events in Syria and with the war that's now beginning to come to conclusion?
Well, I mean, the Turks, they've been saying that the Turks want to actually grab some of Syria and some of Iraq,
right,
as part of the war. And they have occupied a northern strip of Syria, and they do have tanks in Iraq. And if we're talking about Russia, Erdogan is saying, well, maybe we won't join the EU.
Right.
Maybe we'll instead join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, mm-hmm. which is an organization of China, Russia, and the Central Asian states.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
If they did that, they'd probably have to leave NATO.
Wow. And of course, the question is whether NATO will survive as well. All right, let's move to a lighter item. Belgian beer culture is getting granted a UNESCO heritage status. What?
Yes. Well, the Belgians are very proud of their beer.
Right.
Okay, for about the last 10 years or so.
I've enjoyed Belgian beer. Oh, but yes, continue.
Oh, it's very nice.
Yes,
it's very nice. And about 10 or 15 years ago, the UNESCO developed a new type of heritage site, which is basically a cultural heritage site. I mean, everyone knows about the architectural World Heritage Sites.
Right.
Statue of Liberty is one. Stonehenge is another.
Mm-hmm.
But they decided to set up an intangible cultural heritage list.
Wow.
And on that list are things like mariachi bands in Mexico, the samba in Brazil, French cuisine.
What about British cuisine?
Oh, yeah, well, that's right at the top, obviously. Now it looks as if beer culture in Belgium is going to be added to it.
Wow.
I should add that there are no cultural heritage sites in the U.S.
Oh, well.
And the reason is because the U.S. has stopped contributing to UNESCO.
Well, you know what? You're not hearing a bit of complaint about that. I'll tell you what they could have. I still like the idea of having British cuisine as a cultural effort as well. We'll have to talk about that at a later date. Tom Arms, of course, of Look Ahead Radio, and you hear that every Friday afternoon here on the talk station and radio stations around the world, and also lookaheadnews.com.
Look Ahead Radio is a production of the talk station.